Remember when cheap dinners made meat last all week? After the Depression and World War II, most Americans were struggling, but a few resilient families kept the nation fed. Grandma stretched every scrap into multiple meals. Somehow, we forgot her tricks. Let's rediscover 60 cheap 1950s dinners that made meat last all week. It was a meat-stretching dinner perfect for Sunday suppers when chicken was too expensive. Grandma threaded small cubes of pork shoulder and veal onto wooden skewers, forming a shape that looked like a drumstick. She seasoned the meat with salt, pepper, and paprika, then rolled each skewer in beaten egg and breadcrumbs until fully coated. The skewers were browned in hot oil for about 3 minutes on each side, then covered and baked at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until tender and golden. It took hardly an hour from start to finish. The result was crispy on the outside, juicy and savory inside, with a texture that fooled everyone into thinking they were eating real chicken legs. It was served hot with mashed potatoes, gravy, and green beans at church suppers or when company came over. Some grandmas added garlic powder or onion powder to the breadcrumb coating. Others fried the skewers completely on the stovetop without baking. It was a budget dinner that looked expensive enough for special occasions. Grandma mixed 1 pound of ground beef with 1 beaten egg, 2 tablespoons of breadcrumbs, 1 teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce, salt, and pepper in a large bowl until well combined. She shaped the mixture into thick, round patties, about 2 inches tall, making them resemble real filet mignon steaks from a fancy restaurant. Each patty was wrapped tightly with 1 strip of raw bacon, secured with toothpicks, and chilled in the refrigerator for 15 minutes to hold its shape during cooking. The patties were pan-fried in a hot cast-iron skillet for 4 minutes on each side until the bacon crisped and the beef cooked through perfectly. It took hardly 30 minutes to prepare and cook from start to finish. The finished steaks looked elegant, with crispy bacon edges and juicy centers. Some grandmas brushed the patties with melted butter halfway through cooking. It was a make-ahead dinner perfect for warm summer evenings or when company was expected for lunch. Grandma boiled a whole chicken with onions, celery, carrots, salt, and peppercorns in a large pot until the meat fell off the bones, which took about 90 minutes of gentle simmering. She picked the meat clean, discarding skin and bones, then chopped the chicken into small pieces and packed it tightly into a loaf pan with a little of the strained, fat-skimmed broth poured over the top. The pan was refrigerated overnight, allowing the natural gelatin from the chicken bones to set the loaf into a firm, sliceable shape that could be unmolded onto a platter. It took hardly any hands-on time, just patience while it chilled. The finished loaf was pale, smooth and glistening, sliced cold, and served with pickles, mustard, or mayonnaise. Some grandmas added chopped hard-boiled eggs or pimento strips for color. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email, too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. It was a centerpiece dinner that looked fancy but cost almost nothing to make for weeknight meals. Grandma stood 8 to 10 hot dogs upright in a circle inside a round cake pan, tying them together with kitchen string to hold their crown shape during baking. She filled the center hollow with seasoned bread stuffing made from torn white bread, melted butter, diced onions, celery, chicken broth, sage, salt, and pepper, mixed together until moist and fluffy. The entire pan was baked uncovered at 375 degrees for 35 minutes until the hot dogs browned and the stuffing crisped on top. It took hardly 45 minutes total from assembly to table. The finished crown looked impressive when brought to the table, with golden franks standing tall around a savory stuffing center. Some grandmas brushed the hot dogs with ketchup or mustard glaze halfway through baking for extra flavor. It was a stretching trick that turned 1 pound of ground beef into enough meatloaf for multiple meals. Grandma mixed the beef with 1 cup of grape-nuts cereal, 1 beaten egg, 1 small diced onion, half a cup of milk, 1 tablespoon of ketchup, salt and pepper in a large bowl, kneading everything together until the cereal softened and absorbed the moisture completely. The mixture was shaped into a loaf and placed in a greased baking pan, then topped with 3 tablespoons of ketchup spread evenly across the top for a glossy, tangy glaze. It baked at 350 degrees for 1 hour until firm and browned. It took hardly 10 minutes to mix and shape before baking. The finished loaf was dense, hearty, and filling, with a slightly nutty texture from the cereal. Some grandmas added chopped green peppers or grated carrots to the mixture for extra vegetables and moisture. These 5 dinners, city chicken, mock filet mignon, pressed chicken, hot dog crown roast, and grape-nuts meatloaf, stretched cheap cuts and scraps into meals that looked special enough for company. They cost pennies, but felt like something more. Today, they've vanished, replaced by takeout and convenience foods that cost far more. It was a budget dinner with a fancy name that fooled guests into thinking it was something exotic and special. Grandma opened 2 cans of tuna, drained them well, and mixed the flaked fish with 1 can of condensed cream of mushroom soup, half a cup of milk, 1 cup of cooked rice, 1 small diced onion, salt, and pepper in a large bowl until everything combined smoothly. The mixture was poured into a greased casserole dish, topped with a layer of crushed saltine crackers mixed with melted butter and baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until bubbly and golden on top. It took hardly 15 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished casserole was creamy, savory, and filling, served hot straight from the oven with green beans or a simple salad. Some grandmas added frozen peas or diced celery. Others sprinkled shredded cheddar cheese over the top. It was a filling dinner that stretched a little bit of chicken into something that could be served in bowls as a complete meal. Grandma boiled 1 small chicken or a few chicken backs and necks in a large pot of water with onions, celery, and carrots until the meat was tender and falling off the bones, which took about an hour. She strained the broth, picked the meat clean, and set it aside while making a thick white sauce by whisking half a cup of flour into half a cup of melted butter, then slowly adding 4 cups of the hot chicken broth while stirring constantly to prevent lumps from forming. The shredded chicken was added back in, and the soup was simmered for 10 more minutes until it thickened into a velvety spoon-coating consistency. It took hardly any extra time once the chicken was cooked. The finished soup was pale, creamy, and rich. It was a surprise dinner that delighted everyone when sliced at the table to reveal colorful vegetables hidden inside. Grandma mixed 1½ pounds of ground beef with 1 beaten egg to 1 cup of breadcrumbs, 1 small diced onion, half a cup of milk, salt, and pepper in a large bowl until well combined and sticky. She pressed half the mixture into the bottom and sides of a greased loaf pan, creating a hollow boat shape in the center. The hollow was filled with cooked peas and diced carrots mixed with a little butter, then the remaining meat mixture was pressed over the top to seal everything inside completely. The loaf was brushed with a glaze made from ketchup, brown sugar, and a splash of vinegar, then baked at 350 degrees for 1 hour until firm and caramelized. It took hardly 20 minutes to assemble before baking. It was a presentation dinner that looked impressive enough for holiday gatherings, but used up leftover scraps and stale bread. Grandma prepared a savory bread dressing by mixing torn white bread with melted butter, diced onions, celery, chicken or beef broth, sage, salt, and pepper. Then pressed the mixture into a greased ring mold and baked it at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until golden and firm enough to hold its shape when unmolded. Meanwhile, she made a creamed meat filling by heating leftover cooked chicken, turkey, beef, or pork in a thick white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, seasoned with salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg for warmth and depth. The baked dressing ring was carefully turned out onto a large serving platter, and the hot creamed meat was spooned into the center hollow. It took hardly an hour from start to finish. It was a stretching trick that turned 1 pound of ground beef into enough patties for an entire weeknight dinner with leftovers. Grandma mixed the beef with 1 cup of crushed Wheaties cereal, 1 beaten egg, 1 small diced onion, 2 tablespoons of ketchup, 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, salt, and pepper in a large bowl, kneading everything together until the cereal softened and the mixture held together without crumbling. She shaped the mixture into thick patties, then pan-fried them in a hot skillet with a little oil for about 4 minutes on each side until browned and cooked through completely. It took hardly 20 minutes from mixing to plating. The finished burgers were hearty, savory, and slightly sweet from the cereal, with a texture that was firmer and less greasy than regular hamburgers. Some grandmas served them on toasted buns with pickles. These 10 dinners, from city chicken to Wheaties burgers, stretched meat, fooled guests, and made something special out of scraps and cereal. They cost almost nothing, but looked like they belonged on a restaurant menu. Today, they've disappeared, replaced by fast food and convenience meals that cost far more. It was a stretching dinner that used up stale bread and tiny bits of leftover meat into something warm and filling. Grandma tore a loaf of day-old bread into chunks and placed them in a greased casserole dish, then scattered small pieces of cooked ham, chicken, or beef throughout the bread layers. She whisked together 4 eggs, 2 cups of milk, 1 small diced onion, salt, pepper, and a pinch of sage, and then poured the mixture over the bread and pressed everything down with a spoon so the bread soaked up all the liquid completely. The dish was baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the top was golden, crispy, and the center was set like a custard. It took hardly 15 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished pudding was soft inside with a crunchy top. Some grandmas added grated cheese. It was a fun dinner that made ground beef look like fancy chicken legs for special occasions or when children needed coaxing to eat. Grandma mixed 1 pound of ground beef with 1 beaten egg, half a cup of breadcrumbs, 1 small diced onion, salt, pepper, and a pinch of poultry seasoning in a large bowl until well combined and sticky enough to hold its shape. She molded the mixture around wooden skewers into oval, egg-like shapes that resembled drumsticks, then rolled each one in beaten egg and breadcrumbs until fully coated on all sides. The mock drumsticks were pan-fried in hot oil for about 3 minutes on each side, turning carefully to brown evenly, then finished in a covered skillet over low heat for 10 more minutes until cooked through completely. It took hardly 30 minutes from start to finish. The finished drumsticks were crispy and golden. It was a stretching dinner that turned a little bit of chicken into enough casserole for an entire weeknight meal with leftovers. Grandma mixed 2 cups of diced cooked chicken with 2 cups of oyster crackers, 1 can of condensed cream of chicken soup, 1 cup of milk, 1 small diced onion, salt, and pepper in a large bowl until everything was well combined and the crackers began to soften and soak up the liquid. The mixture was poured into a greased casserole dish, topped with another half-cup of crushed oyster crackers, mixed with melted butter for a crunchy topping, and baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 35 minutes until bubbly and golden. It took hardly 15 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished casserole was creamy, savory, and filling, served hot straight from the oven. Some grandmas added frozen peas or diced celery. It was a filling dinner that stretched leftover ham into something rich and satisfying for weeknight meals. Grandma cooked 1 pound of wide egg noodles until tender, then drained them and mixed them with 2 cups of diced cooked ham, 4 beaten eggs, 2 cups of sour cream, 1 cup of cottage cheese, 1 small diced onion, salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg in a large bowl until everything was well combined and the noodles were coated in the creamy mixture. The mixture was poured into a greased baking dish and baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the top was golden and the center was set like a custard. It took hardly 20 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished pudding was dense, savory, and slightly sweet, served hot in squares with a side of applesauce or green beans. Some grandmas added raisins. It was a stretching dinner that made half a pound of ground beef feel like enough for an entire meal. Grandma mixed the cooked and crumbled beef with 2 cups of flour, 2 beaten eggs, adding 1½ cups of milk, 1 small diced onion, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, salt and pepper in a large bowl until a thick, lumpy batter formed. She dropped spoonfuls of the batter onto a hot, greased griddle and cooked each pancake for about 3 minutes on each side until golden and cooked through. It took hardly 30 minutes from mixing to plating. The finished pancakes were savory, filling, and slightly crispy on the edges, served hot with butter, ketchup, or gravy poured over the top. Some grandmas added shredded cheese or diced green peppers to the batter for extra flavor and vegetables. Others served them with applesauce or sour cream. These 15 dinners, from savory bread pudding to beef and onion pancakes, stretched leftovers, cereal, crackers, and small amounts of meat into full meals that cost almost nothing. They looked like something special, but they were born from necessity. Today, they've vanished, replaced by convenience foods, and forgotten by younger generations entirely. It was a filling dinner that made a package of hot dogs stretch into something hearty enough for weeknight meals. Grandma placed 8 hot dogs in a greased baking dish, spacing them evenly so they wouldn't touch during baking. She whisked together 2 cups of flour, 2 beaten eggs, 1½ cups of milk, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and a pinch of salt in a bowl until smooth. Then poured the batter over the hot dogs, making sure they were mostly covered but still peeking through the top. The dish was baked at 400 degrees for 30 minutes until the batter puffed up golden and crispy around the hot dogs. It took hardly 10 minutes to prepare before baking. The finished dish was served hot, sliced into squares with each piece containing a hot dog surrounded by fluffy Yorkshire pudding-like bread. Some grandmas served it with ketchup or mustard. It was a filling dinner that turned 1 jar of dried chipped beef into enough creamy sauce to cover multiple slices of toast. Grandma tore the beef into small pieces and rinsed them briefly under cold water to remove excess salt. She melted 4 tablespoons of butter in a skillet, whisked in 4 tablespoons of flour to make a thick roux, then slowly added 2 cups of milk, while stirring constantly until the sauce thickened and became smooth and creamy. The beef was stirred into the sauce and simmered for 5 minutes until heated through. It took hardly 15 minutes from start to finish. The finished dish was served hot, ladled generously over toasted white bread or biscuits. Some grandmas added a pinch of black pepper or a dash of Worcestershire sauce for extra flavor. Others served it over mashed potatoes or rice, instead of toast for a more filling meal. It was a budget dinner that made leftover chicken feel fancy enough for Sunday suppers or when company came over unexpectedly. Grandma mixed 2 cups of diced cooked chicken with 1 can of condensed cream of chicken soup, half a cup of milk, 1 cup of frozen mixed vegetables, salt, and pepper in a bowl until everything was well combined. She poured the mixture into a greased pie dish, then topped it with a crust made from 2 cups of crushed vanilla wafers or saltine crackers mixed with half a cup of melted butter, pressing it gently over the filling. The pie was baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the crust was golden and the filling bubbled around the edges. It took hardly 20 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished pie was creamy and savory with a slightly sweet, crunchy topping. Some grandmas used only saltines for a purely savory crust. It was a stretching dinner that turned leftover ham scraps and inexpensive ground pork into something that looked and tasted like a proper roast. Grandma ground leftover ham in a meat grinder, or asked the butcher to grind it, then mixed it with an equal amount of ground pork, 1 beaten egg, 1 cup of breadcrumbs, half a cup of milk, 1 small diced onion, salt and pepper in a large bowl until everything combined smoothly. She shaped the mixture into a loaf, placed it in a greased baking pan, and spread a glaze made from brown sugar, mustard, and a splash of vinegar over the top. It baked at 350 degrees for 1 hour until firm and caramelized. It took hardly 20 minutes to mix and shape before baking. The finished loaf was pink, glossy, and slightly sweet, sliced and served hot with mashed potatoes or cold in sandwiches the next day. It was a stretching trick that turned 1 pound of ground beef into enough patties for an entire weeknight dinner with leftovers for lunch. Grandma mixed the beef with 1 cup of Rice Krispies cereal, 1 beaten egg, 1 small diced onion, 2 tablespoons of ketchup, 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, salt and pepper in a large bowl, kneading everything together until the cereal softened slightly and the mixture held together without falling apart. She shaped the mixture into thick patties, then pan-fried them in a hot skillet with a little oil for about 4 minutes on each side until browned and cooked through. It took hardly 25 minutes from mixing to plating. The finished patties were hearty, slightly crunchy, and held their shape well, unserved on toasted buns with pickles and mustard or plated with mashed potatoes and gravy like Salisbury steaks. It was a quick dinner that stretched a package of hot dogs into something hearty enough for weeknight meals when the budget was tight. Grandma sliced 8 hot dogs into thick rounds and set them aside while she diced 1 large onion and minced 2 cloves of garlic. She heated 2 tablespoons of oil in a large skillet, then sautéed the onion and garlic until soft and fragrant, which took about 5 minutes. She added 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1 can of tomato sauce, 1 teaspoon of paprika, half a teaspoon of sugar to balance the acidity, salt, and pepper, stirring everything together until it simmered gently. The sliced hot dogs were added to the tomato mixture along with 2 cups of uncooked elbow macaroni and enough water to cover everything by about an inch. The skillet was covered and simmered for 15 minutes, stirring occasionally until the macaroni was tender and had absorbed most of the liquid. It took hardly 30 minutes from start to finish. The finished goulash was thick, savory, and slightly tangy, served hot in deep bowls with a sprinkle of grated Parmesan cheese on top, if the family had any on hand. Some grandmas added a diced green bell pepper along with the onions for extra vegetables and color throughout the dish. Others stirred in a dollop of sour cream just before serving to make the sauce creamier and richer. A few used leftover cooked sausage or even canned Vienna sausages instead of hot dogs when that was what they had in the pantry, and the dish worked just as well with any inexpensive protein. It was a one-pot dinner that required no browning or pre-cooking, just raw ingredients layered in a tall casserole dish and baked until everything steamed together into something filling and comforting. Grandma started by spreading 1 pound of raw ground beef across the bottom of a greased deep baking dish, breaking it into small clumps with her fingers and seasoning it generously with salt and pepper. She layered 1 large sliced onion over the beef, then 1 cup of uncooked long-grain rice, spread evenly over the onions, followed by 1 can of diced tomatoes poured over the rice, and finally 2 cups of thinly sliced potatoes arranged in overlapping layers on top. She poured 2 cups of hot water or beef broth over the entire casserole, covered it tightly with aluminum foil, and baked it at 350 degrees for 1½ hours until the potatoes were tender, the rice was cooked, and the beef was fully done. It took hardly 10 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished shipwreck was steamy, fragrant, and layered with flavors that had melded together during the long bake, served hot straight from the dish with each person getting a scoop of every layer. Some grandmas added a layer of shredded cabbage or diced celery between the onions and rice for extra vegetables and moisture. Others sprinkled shredded cheese over the top during the last 15 minutes of baking for a golden melted finish. A few replaced the beef with pork sausage or even leftover chicken for variety when budgets were especially tight. It was a stovetop dinner that combined ground beef, macaroni, and vegetables into one skillet for a quick, filling weeknight meal that everyone loved. Grandma browned 1 pound of ground beef in a large, deep skillet over medium-high heat, breaking it into small crumbles as it cooked and draining off most of the fat once it was fully browned. She added 1 large diced onion and 1 large diced green bell pepper to the skillet with the beef, stirring everything together and cooking for another 5 minutes until the vegetables softened and became fragrant. She poured in 1 can of tomato sauce, 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1 teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce, half a teaspoon of sugar, salt, and pepper, stirring everything together and bringing it to a gentle simmer. 2 cups of uncooked elbow macaroni and 1 cup of water were added to the skillet, and the mixture was covered and simmered for 15 minutes, stirring occasionally until the macaroni was tender and had absorbed most of the liquid. It took hardly 35 minutes from start to finish. The finished chop suey was thick, savory, and slightly sweet, served hot in deep bowls with a sprinkle of grated Parmesan or cheddar cheese on top. Some grandmas added diced celery or mushrooms along with the peppers for extra vegetables and texture. Others stirred in a spoonful of sour cream or a pat of butter at the end for a creamier, richer finish. A few replaced the elbow macaroni with wide egg noodles or even leftover cooked spaghetti when that was what they had in the pantry. It was a filling dinner that turned the most affordable chicken parts into something rich and satisfying for weeknight meals when money was especially tight. Grandma trimmed 1 pound of fresh chicken livers, cutting away any green bits or connective tissue, then patted them dry with a paper towel and seasoned them generously with salt and pepper. She dredged the livers lightly in flour, and then browned them in 2 tablespoons of hot butter or bacon fat in a large skillet for about 2 minutes on each side until they were golden on the outside but still slightly pink inside. The livers were removed and set aside while she made a quick gravy by adding 1 diced onion to the same skillet, cooking it until soft, then whisking in 2 tablespoons of flour and slowly adding 1½ cups of chicken broth while stirring constantly until the gravy thickened and became smooth. The livers were returned to the skillet, nestled into the gravy, and simmered gently for 5 more minutes until cooked through and tender. It took hardly 25 minutes from start to finish. The finished dish was rich, earthy, and deeply savory, served hot over a generous mound of steamed white rice that soaked up all the gravy. Some grandmas added sliced mushrooms or diced green peppers to the gravy for extra vegetables and flavor. Others stirred in a splash of sherry or a spoonful of sour cream at the end for a fancier, richer finish. A few cooked the livers with bacon instead of butter for a smokier, heartier taste. It was a quick dinner that turned 2 cans of tuna into something creamy and comforting enough for weeknight meals, especially on Fridays when meat was traditionally avoided in many households. Grandma melted 4 tablespoons of butter in a large saucepan, then whisked in 4 tablespoons of flour to make a thick roux, cooking it for about 1 minute until it smelled slightly nutty but hadn't browned. She slowly poured in 2 cups of milk while whisking constantly to prevent lumps, then stirred the sauce over medium heat until it thickened into a smooth, creamy consistency that coated the back of a spoon. 2 cans of drained tuna were flaked into the sauce, along with 1 cup of frozen peas, salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg for warmth and depth. The mixture was simmered gently for 5 minutes until the peas were tender and everything was heated through. It took hardly 15 minutes from start to finish. The finished wiggle was creamy, savory, and slightly rich, served hot-ladled generously over slices of toasted white bread or over cooked egg noodles for a more filling meal. Some grandmas added diced celery or diced hard-boiled eggs to the sauce for extra texture and protein. Others stirred in a tablespoon of lemon juice or a splash of Worcestershire sauce for extra brightness and tang. A few topped each, serving with a sprinkle of crushed saltine crackers or breadcrumbs for a little crunch on top. It was a layered dinner that required no mixing or pre-cooking, just raw ingredients stacked carefully in a tall casserole dish and baked until everything steamed together into something hearty and filling. Grandma started by spreading 1 cup of uncooked long-grain rice across the bottom of a greased deep baking dish, on seasoning it lightly with salt and pepper. She layered 1 pound of raw ground beef in clumps over the rice, breaking it into small pieces with her fingers, then added 1 large sliced onion spread evenly over the beef. The next layer was 1 diced green bell pepper, followed by 1 can of diced tomatoes poured over the peppers, then 2 cups of thinly sliced raw potatoes arranged in overlapping circles on top. She poured 2½ cups of hot water or beef broth over the entire casserole, covered it tightly with aluminum foil, and baked it at 350 degrees for 1½ hours until the rice was tender. The beef was cooked through, and the potatoes were soft. It took hardly 15 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished dinner was steamy, fragrant, and deeply satisfying, with every layer contributing its own flavor and texture to the whole. Some grandmas added a layer of shredded cabbage or sliced carrots for extra vegetables and color. Others sprinkled shredded cheese over the top during the last 10 minutes of baking for a golden melted finish. A few replaced the ground beef with pork sausage or leftover chicken for variety when that was what they had available. It was a presentation dinner that turned leftover meat and mashed potatoes into something impressive enough for Sunday suppers or when company dropped by unexpectedly. Grandma browned 1 pound of ground beef in a large skillet with 1 diced onion, 1 diced carrot, and 1 stalk of diced celery, cooking everything together until the beef was fully browned and the vegetables were soft. She stirred in 1 tablespoon of flour to thicken the mixture, then added 1 cup of beef broth, 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, salt and pepper, simmering everything for 10 minutes until the gravy thickened and the flavors melded together. The meat mixture was poured into a greased casserole dish and spread evenly across the bottom. Meanwhile, she prepared mashed potatoes by boiling 4 large peeled potatoes until tender, then mashing them with butter, milk, salt, and pepper until smooth and creamy. Instead of spreading the potatoes flat over the meat like traditional shepherd's pie, Grandma used a spoon to dollop the mashed potatoes in tall, pointed peaks across the top, creating teepee shapes that would brown beautifully in the oven. The dish was baked uncovered at 400 degrees for 20 minutes until the peaks turned golden and crispy. It took hardly an hour from start to finish. The finished wigwam pie was visually striking, with crispy golden potato peaks standing tall above savory, rich meat filling. Some grandmas brushed the potato peaks with melted butter before baking for extra richness and shine. Others sprinkled shredded cheese over the meat layer before adding the potatoes for a hidden cheesy surprise inside. It was a catch-all dinner that used up whatever vegetables, pantry staples, and leftover meat scraps Grandma had on hand, all simmered together into something thick, hearty, and deeply satisfying. Grandma browned 1 pound of ground beef in a large, heavy pot, breaking it into small crumbles as it cooked and draining off most of the fat once it was fully browned. She added 1 large diced onion, 2 diced carrots, 2 diced celery stalks, and 2 minced cloves of garlic to the pot, stirring everything together and cooking for about 5 minutes until the vegetables began to soften and smell fragrant. She poured in 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1 can of tomato sauce, 2 cups of beef broth or water, 1 cup of uncooked elbow macaroni, 1 cup of frozen corn or canned corn drained, 1 teaspoon of chili powder, half a teaspoon of paprika, salt and pepper, stirring everything together and bringing it to a boil. The heat was reduced to a gentle simmer, and the pot was covered and cooked for 20 minutes, stirring occasionally, until the macaroni was tender and the flavors had melded together into something rich and comforting. It took hardly 40 minutes from start to finish. The finished slumgullion was thick, messy, and full of different textures and flavors in every spoonful, served hot in deep bowls with crackers or cornbread on the side. Some grandmas added leftover cooked potatoes, green beans, or canned kidney beans to the pot for extra bulk and variety. Others stirred in a handful of shredded cheese at the end for a creamier, richer finish. It was a stretching dinner that turned leftover chicken and a handful of spaghetti into something creamy, cheesy, and impressive enough for Sunday suppers or potlucks. Grandma cooked 1 pound of spaghetti in boiling salted water until just tender, then drained it and set it aside. Meanwhile, she melted 4 tablespoons of butter in a large saucepan, then sautéed 1 cup of sliced mushrooms and 1 small diced onion until soft and golden, which took about 5 minutes. She whisked in 4 tablespoons of flour to make a thick roux, cooking it for 1 minute, then slowly poured in 2 cups of chicken broth and 1 cup of heavy cream while whisking constantly until the sauce thickened and became smooth and velvety. 2 cups of diced cooked chicken were stirred into the sauce, along with half a cup of grated Parmesan cheese, salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg for warmth. The cooked spaghetti was added to the sauce and tossed until every strand was coated. Then the entire mixture was poured into a greased baking dish, topped with another half cup of grated Parmesan and a handful of breadcrumbs, and baked uncovered at 375 degrees for 25 minutes until bubbly and golden on top. It took hardly an hour from start to finish. The finished tetrazzini was rich, creamy, and indulgent, served hot straight from the dish with a side salad or green beans. Some grandmas added frozen peas or diced pimentos to the sauce for color and extra vegetables. Others used leftover turkey instead of chicken, especially after Thanksgiving or Christmas, when there was plenty to use up. It was a hearty dinner that combined a savory meat filling with a thick bread-like cornmeal topping baked together until golden and bubbling. Grandma browned 1 pound of ground beef in a large skillet with 1 diced onion and 1 diced green bell pepper, cooking everything together until the beef was fully browned and the vegetables were soft. She stirred in 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1 cup of frozen or canned corn drained, 1 tablespoon of chili powder, 1 teaspoon of cumin, half a teaspoon of paprika, salt, and pepper, simmering everything together for 10 minutes until the flavors melded and the mixture thickened slightly. The filling was poured into a greased casserole dish and spread evenly across the bottom. Meanwhile, she prepared the cornmeal topping by whisking together 1 cup of cornmeal, 1 cup of flour, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, and a pinch of salt in a bowl, then stirring in 1 beaten egg, 1 cup of milk, and 2 tablespoons of melted butter until a thick batter formed. The batter was poured over the meat filling, spreading it gently to cover the entire surface. The dish was baked uncovered at 375 degrees for 30 minutes until the topping was golden, firm, and slightly cracked on top. It took hardly 50 minutes from start to finish. The finished tamale pie was hearty, savory, and slightly sweet from the cornmeal crust, served hot in squares with a dollop of sour cream or a sprinkle of shredded cheese on top. Some grandmas added sliced black olives or diced jalapenos to the filling for extra flavor and heat. These 30 dinners, from Frankfurter goulash to tamale pie, stretched meat, vegetables, and pantry staples into meals that filled plates, warmed bellies, and cost almost nothing. They looked impressive, tasted comforting, and made every dollar count. Today, they've vanished, are replaced by takeout and convenience foods that offer less for far more. It was a tenderizing dinner that transformed cheap, tough cuts of beef into something melt-in-your-mouth tender through patient pounding and slow simmering in rich tomato gravy. Grandma started with 1½ pounds of round steak, or chuck steak, cut into individual serving-sized pieces about ½ an inch thick. She placed each piece on a cutting board and used the textured side of a meat mallet to pound the beef repeatedly, working the flour into the meat fibers to break down the tough connective tissue and make it tender. She seasoned both sides of each piece with salt and pepper, then dredged them lightly in flour. The steaks were browned in 2 tablespoons of hot oil in a large, heavy skillet for about 3 minutes on each side, until golden, then removed and set aside. In the same skillet, she sautéed 1 large sliced onion and 1 diced green bell pepper until soft, then added 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1 can of tomato sauce, 1 teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce, half a teaspoon of sugar, salt, and pepper, stirring everything together into a thick, fragrant gravy. The browned steaks were returned to the skillet, nestled into the gravy, and the skillet was covered and simmered gently on low heat for 1½ hours until the beef was fork-tender and the gravy had thickened. It took hardly any hands-on time once the simmering began. The finished Swiss steak was rich, savory, and fall-apart tender, served hot with mashed potatoes or rice to soak up every drop of the tomato gravy. Some grandmas added sliced mushrooms or diced celery to the gravy for extra vegetables and flavor. Others finished the dish with a dollop of sour cream stirred into the gravy for extra richness. It was a fun dinner that stretched ground beef with uncooked rice, which poked out of the meatballs during cooking like little porcupine quills that children found delightful. Grandma mixed 1 pound of ground beef with half a cup of uncooked long-grain white rice, 1 beaten egg, 1 small diced onion, 1 teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce, salt and pepper in a large bowl, kneading everything together until well combined and sticky. She shaped the mixture into about 16 walnut-sized meatballs, rolling them gently between her palms, and placed them in a single layer in a large, deep skillet or Dutch oven. She poured 1 can of tomato sauce and 1 can of water over the meatballs, added a pinch of sugar to balance the acidity, then brought the liquid to a gentle simmer over medium heat. The skillet was covered tightly and the meatballs were simmered for 45 minutes without lifting the lid, allowing the rice inside to steam and cook until tender, while the grains poked out through the meat like little quills. It took hardly an hour from start to finish. The finished porcupine meatballs were tender, savory, and visually charming, served hot in shallow bowls with the tomato sauce spooned over the top and plenty of crusty bread on the side for soaking up the sauce. Some grandmas added diced green peppers or mushrooms to the tomato sauce for extra vegetables and flavor. Others replaced the tomato sauce with cream of mushroom soup thinned with milk for a creamy, milder version that children who didn't like tomatoes would eat happily. A few added a handful of frozen peas to the skillet during the last 10 minutes of cooking for color and nutrition. It was a stretching dinner that turned leftover chicken and a little bit of mashed potato into crispy, golden croquettes that felt fancy enough for Sunday suppers or when company came over. Grandma mixed 2 cups of finely chopped or ground-cooked chicken with 1 cup of cold mashed potatoes, 2 tablespoons of melted butter, 1 beaten egg, 1 small diced onion, 2 tablespoons of chopped fresh parsley, salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg in a large bowl until everything combined into a thick, moldable paste. She shaped the mixture into small cone shapes or oval patties, then chilled them in the refrigerator for 30 minutes to firm up and hold their shape during frying. Each croquette was rolled in flour, dipped in beaten egg, and coated generously in breadcrumbs, ensuring a thick, even crust all around. The croquettes were fried in about 2 inches of hot oil for 3 to 4 minutes, turning once until they were deep golden brown and crispy on all sides. It took hardly an hour from start to finish, including chilling time. The finished croquettes were crispy on the outside, creamy and savory on the inside, served hot with a drizzle of gravy, a dollop of cranberry sauce, or a squeeze of lemon juice on the side. Some grandmas added diced celery or grated cheese to the chicken mixture for extra flavor and texture. And others used leftover turkey instead of chicken, especially after Thanksgiving when there was plenty to use up. A few baked the croquettes in a hot oven instead of frying them to save oil and make them slightly lighter, though they weren't quite as crispy. It was a one-pan dinner that stretched a few strips of bacon and a cup of rice into something savory, filling, and satisfying enough for weeknight meals when the budget was especially tight. Grandma fried 4 strips of bacon in a large, deep skillet until crispy, then removed them and set them aside, leaving the bacon fat in the pan. She added 1 diced onion and 1 diced green bell pepper to the bacon fat and sautéed them until soft and fragrant, which took about 5 minutes. She stirred in 1 cup of uncooked long-grain white rice, uncoating every grain in the bacon fat and toasting it lightly for about 2 minutes until it smelled slightly nutty. She poured in 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1½ cups of water or chicken broth, 1 teaspoon of chili powder, ½ teaspoon of cumin, salt and pepper, stirring everything together and bringing it to a boil. The heat was reduced to low, the skillet was covered tightly, and the rice was simmered for 20 minutes without lifting the lid until all the liquid was absorbed and the rice was tender and fluffy. It took hardly 35 minutes from start to finish. The finished Spanish rice was savory, slightly smoky from the bacon and flecked with colorful vegetables, served hot in bowls with the crumbled bacon sprinkled on top. Some grandmas added frozen peas or corn during the last 5 minutes of cooking for extra vegetables and sweetness. Others stirred in a handful of shredded cheese at the end for a creamier, richer finish. A few used leftover cooked sausage instead of bacon for a heartier, meatier version. It was a stretching dinner that made inexpensive, thin-cut beef look and feel like a proper steak through a thick, crispy breading and rich gravy. Grandma started with 4 pieces of cube steak or round steak that had been pounded thin by the butcher, each about a 1/4 inch thick. She seasoned both sides of each piece with salt, pepper, and a pinch of paprika, then dredged them in flour, shaking off the excess. Each steak was dipped in a mixture of 1 beaten egg and 2 tablespoons of milk, then pressed firmly into seasoned flour again to create a thick, double coating that would fry up extra crispy. The steaks were fried in about 1/2 inch of hot oil in a large cast-iron skillet for about 3 minutes on each side until deep golden brown and crispy all over, then removed and kept warm. To make the gravy, she poured off all but 2 tablespoons of the frying oil, whisked in 2 tablespoons of flour to make a roux, and slowly added 1½ cups of milk, while stirring constantly until the gravy thickened and became smooth and creamy. The gravy was seasoned with salt, pepper, and a pinch of black pepper, then simmered for 5 more minutes until it coated the back of a spoon. It took hardly 35 minutes from start to finish. The finished country fried steak was crispy, golden, and served hot with the creamy white gravy poured generously over the top, alongside mashed potatoes and green beans. Some grandmas added a splash of hot sauce or Worcestershire sauce to the gravy for extra flavor and depth. Others used buttermilk instead of regular milk in the egg wash for a tangier, Southern-style coating. These 35 dinners, from city chicken to country fried steak, stretched every cut of meat, every leftover, every pantry staple into meals that filled plates without emptying wallets. They looked special, tasted comforting, and made every dollar count. It was a stretching dinner that turned 1/2 pound of beef scraps or stew meat into enough rich, gravy-covered dinner for an entire weeknight meal. Grandma cut the beef into small, bite-sized pieces and seasoned them generously with salt and pepper. She dredged the pieces lightly in flour, then browned them in 2 tablespoons of hot oil in a large skillet for about 3 minutes on each side, until they were golden and crusty on the outside. The beef was removed and set aside while she made the gravy by adding 1 diced onion and 1 cup of sliced mushrooms to the same skillet, cooking them until soft and golden, which took about 5 minutes. She whisked in 2 tablespoons of flour, stirring it into the mushroom mixture to make a thick roux, then slowly poured in 2 cups of beef broth while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The gravy was brought to a simmer and cooked for about 5 minutes until it thickened and became smooth and glossy. The browned beef was returned to the skillet, nestled into the gravy, and simmered gently for another 10 minutes until the beef was tender and the flavors had melded together. It took hardly 40 minutes from start to finish. The finished beef tips were rich, savory, and deeply flavorful, served hot over a huge mound of cooked egg noodles that soaked up every drop of the brown gravy. Some grandmas added a splash of Worcestershire sauce or a spoonful of sour cream to the gravy for extra richness and tang. Others used leftover roast beef instead of raw stew meat, cutting the cooking time in half since the beef was already tender. A few served the beef tips over mashed potatoes or rice instead of noodles for variety. It was a filling dinner that stretched a small chicken or a few chicken pieces into something comforting and satisfying by adding big, fluffy dumplings that soaked up the broth and made everyone feel full. Grandma boiled 1 whole chicken or 2 pounds of chicken pieces in a large pot of water with 1 diced onion, 2 diced carrots, 2 diced celery stalks, salt, and pepper until the meat was tender and falling off the bones, which took about 90 minutes. She removed the chicken, picked the meat clean, discarding the skin and bones, and returned the shredded meat to the pot along with the strained broth. Meanwhile, she prepared the dumpling dough by mixing 2 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2 tablespoons of cold butter cut into small pieces, and 3/4 of a cup of milk in a bowl until a thick, sticky dough formed. She dropped large spoonfuls of the dough directly onto the surface of the simmering broth, spacing them so they wouldn't touch, then covered the pot tightly and simmered everything for 15 minutes without lifting the lid, allowing the dumplings to steam and puff up until they were light, fluffy, and cooked through. It took hardly 2 hours total, with most of that time being passive simmering. The finished chicken and dumplings were rich, comforting, and deeply satisfying, served hot in deep bowls with plenty of broth and a generous helping of fluffy dumplings in every serving. Some grandmas added frozen peas or corn during the last 10 minutes of cooking for extra vegetables and color. Others used leftover turkey instead of chicken, especially after the holidays when there was plenty to use up. It was a budget dinner that turned the cheapest chicken parts into something tender and flavorful by braising them slowly in a rich, buttery yellow gravy. Grandma cut 2 pounds of chicken wings at the joints into drumettes and flats, then seasoned them generously with salt and pepper. She dredged the wings lightly in flour, shaking off the excess, then browned them in 2 tablespoons of hot butter in a large, deep skillet for about 3 minutes on each side until they were golden and crispy all over. The wings were removed and set aside while she made the gravy by adding 1 diced onion to the same skillet, cooking it until soft and golden, which took about 5 minutes. She whisked in 3 tablespoons of flour, stirring it into the butter and onion to make a thick roux, then slowly poured in 2 cups of chicken broth while whisking constantly to prevent lumps. The gravy was brought to a simmer and cooked for about 5 minutes until it thickened and became smooth and velvety. The browned wings were returned to the skillet, nestled into the gravy, and the skillet was covered and simmered gently on low heat for 45 minutes until the wings were fall-apart tender and the gravy had thickened even more. It took hardly an hour and 15 minutes from start to finish. The finished fricasseed wings were rich, buttery, and deeply savory, served hot over mashed potatoes or rice with plenty of the yellow gravy spooned over the top. Some grandmas added diced carrots or celery to the gravy for extra vegetables and sweetness. Others stirred in a splash of cream or a spoonful of sour cream at the end for an even richer, creamier finish. It was a stretching dinner that turned 2 cans of tuna into something hearty and sliceable enough to serve like a proper meatloaf. Grandma mixed 2 cans of drained tuna with 2 cups of cooked white rice, 2 beaten eggs, half a cup of breadcrumbs, 1 small diced onion, 2 tablespoons of chopped fresh parsley, 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, salt, and pepper in a large bowl, kneading everything together until it formed a thick, moldable mixture that held together when pressed. She shaped the mixture into a loaf and placed it in a greased loaf pan, pressing it down firmly and smoothing the top. The loaf was brushed with 2 tablespoons of melted butter for extra richness and shine, then baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the top was golden and the loaf was firm enough to slice without falling apart. It took hardly 15 minutes to prepare before baking. The finished tuna rice loaf was firm, savory, and slightly tangy from the lemon, served hot in thick slices with a side of tartar sauce, ketchup, or a simple white sauce poured over the top. Some grandmas added diced celery or grated carrots to the mixture for extra vegetables and moisture. Others mixed in a handful of shredded cheddar cheese for a richer, cheesier flavor throughout the loaf. A few served it cold the next day in sandwiches with lettuce and mayonnaise, making it stretch even further across the week. The loaf could also be shaped into patties and pan-fried instead of baked, creating crispy tuna cakes that children loved to eat with their hands. It was a quick dinner that turned a few cans of deviled ham into something filling enough for weeknight meals when time and money were both tight. Grandma opened 2 small cans of deviled ham and scraped the contents into a bowl, then stirred in 2 tablespoons of mayonnaise, 1 teaspoon of mustard, 1 tablespoon of pickle relish, and a pinch of black pepper, mixing everything together until smooth and spreadable. She toasted 6 slices of white bread until golden and crispy, then spread the deviled ham mixture thickly on each slice, making sure to cover it all the way to the edges. Each slice was cut diagonally into triangles, arranged on a platter, and served warm or at room temperature with a side of potato chips, pickles, or a simple green salad. It took hardly 10 minutes from start to finish. The deviled ham triangles were savory, slightly tangy, and rich from the mayonnaise, with a texture that was smooth and spreadable, but still felt substantial enough to be called dinner. Some grandmas added a thin slice of cheese on top of the ham spread before cutting the toast into triangles, creating a melty, cheesy layer. Others topped each triangle with a thin slice of tomato or a leaf of lettuce for freshness and color. A few used the deviled ham as a filling for grilled cheese sandwiches instead of spreading it on plain toast, frying the sandwiches in butter until golden and crispy on both sides. The canned ham was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and always ready in the pantry, and making it a reliable option when Grandma needed dinner on the table fast without spending much money or effort. These 40 dinners, from city chicken to deviled ham triangles, stretched meat, leftovers, and pantry staples into meals that filled plates, warmed bellies, and cost almost nothing. They looked special, tasted comforting, and made every dollar count. Today, they've vanished, replaced by takeout and convenience foods that cost more but offer far less satisfaction. It was a stretching dinner that turned a small amount of pork into something filling and satisfying by combining it with hominy, a type of hulled corn that swelled up large and chewy when cooked, making every spoonful feel substantial and hearty. Grandma cut 1 pound of pork shoulder or pork chops into small, bite-sized cubes and seasoned them generously with salt, pepper, and a pinch of cumin for warmth and depth of flavor. She browned the pork pieces in 2 tablespoons of hot oil in a large, deep skillet over medium-high heat, stirring occasionally until they were golden and slightly crispy on all sides, which took about 7 minutes. The pork was removed and set aside while she added 1 large diced onion and 1 diced green bell pepper to the same skillet, cooking them in the remaining pork fat until they were soft and fragrant, which took another 5 minutes. She stirred in 2 cans of drained white hominy, 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1 teaspoon of chili powder, half a teaspoon of paprika, a pinch of sugar to balance the acidity of the tomatoes, salt, and pepper. I'm mixing everything together until well combined and fragrant. The browned pork was returned to the skillet, nestled into the hominy mixture, and everything was brought to a gentle simmer. The skillet was covered and cooked on low heat for 30 minutes, stirring occasionally until the pork was tender, The hominy had absorbed the flavors from the sauce, and the liquid had thickened slightly into a rich, savory gravy. It took hardly 50 minutes from start to finish. The finished pork and hominy skillet was hearty, slightly spicy, and deeply satisfying, with the large, chewy hominy kernels making every bite feel substantial and filling, even though the actual amount of pork was quite small. It was served hot in deep bowls with warm tortillas, cornbread, or saltine crackers on the side for scooping up the sauce and soaking up every last drop of flavor. Some grandmas added a diced jalapeno or a pinch of red pepper flakes to the skillet for extra heat and spice that made the dish feel more exciting and flavorful. Others stirred in a handful of shredded cheese or a dollop of sour cream at the end for a creamier, richer finish that balanced the spice and acidity. A few used leftover cooked pork or even diced ham instead of raw pork to cut the cooking time in half, making it a true end-of-the-week meal that used up whatever was left in the refrigerator without wasting anything. The hominy was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and incredibly filling, and making it the perfect stretching ingredient that allowed Grandma to make a little bit of meat go a long way without anyone feeling like they didn't get enough to eat or that dinner was lacking in substance. It was a catch-all dinner that used up every little scrap of leftover meat from the week: ham, chicken, beef, sausage, bacon, and folded it all into a huge pan of scrambled eggs for a quick, protein-packed weeknight meal that felt satisfying and comforting without requiring much effort or skill. Grandma gathered about 2 cups of assorted leftover cooked meat, dicing it all into small uniform pieces so everything would cook evenly and distribute well throughout the eggs. She heated 2 tablespoons of butter in a large cast-iron skillet over medium heat, then added 1 diced onion and cooked it until soft and golden, which took about 5 minutes, and added a sweet, savory base flavor to the dish. The diced meat was added to the skillet and stirred for another 3 minutes to heat it through and let the flavors meld with the onions and butter. Meanwhile, she cracked 8 to 10 eggs into a large bowl, whisked them together with a 1/4 cup of milk, salt, pepper, and a pinch of paprika for color and a subtle smoky flavor, then poured the egg mixture over the meat and onions in the skillet. She stirred the eggs gently with a wooden spoon, scraping the bottom and sides of the pan as curds began to form, cooking everything slowly over low heat until the eggs were just set, but still soft and creamy, which took about 7 minutes. It took hardly 20 minutes from start to finish. The finished scramble was fluffy, savory, and packed with different flavors and textures from all the different leftover meats, served hot, straight from the skillet onto plates with buttered toast or biscuits on the side for soaking up the eggs. Some grandmas added diced green peppers, mushrooms, or tomatoes to the scramble for extra vegetables, color, and nutrition. Others sprinkled shredded cheese over the top during the last minute of cooking, letting it melt into the eggs for a creamier, richer finish that children especially loved. A few served the scramble with a side of fried potatoes or hash browns to make it feel even more filling and substantial, turning it into a true breakfast-for-dinner meal that everyone enjoyed. The beauty of Sunday night scramble was that it never tasted the same twice, whatever meat scraps, and vegetable odds and ends, or cheese bits Grandma had in the refrigerator got folded into the eggs, making it a true kitchen sink meal that wasted nothing and fed everyone well. It was the ultimate zero-waste dinner that turned the week's leftovers into something warm, comforting, and satisfying enough to start the new week off right without spending any money or effort on fresh ingredients. It was a simple dinner that required almost no skill or effort, just a few ingredients dumped into a casserole dish and baked until everything came together into something creamy, tender, and comforting that pleased even the pickiest eaters. Grandma spread 1½ cups of uncooked long-grain white rice evenly across the bottom of a greased 9 by 13-inch baking dish, unseasoning it lightly with salt and pepper so the rice wouldn't taste bland. She arranged 4 to 6 pieces of chicken, drumsticks, thighs, or breasts, on top of the rice in a single layer, spacing them so they wouldn't overlap, then seasoned them generously with salt, pepper, paprika, and garlic powder for extra flavor and a golden, appetizing color. She poured 1 can of condensed cream of mushroom soup directly over the chicken without diluting it, letting the thick soup coat the chicken and drip down into the rice below. Then she added 1½ cups of water or chicken broth, pouring it carefully around the edges of the dish so the rice would have enough liquid to cook properly and absorb all the flavors from the soup and chicken. The entire dish was covered tightly with aluminum foil to trap the steam and keep the chicken moist. Then baked at 350 degrees for 1 hour and 15 minutes until the chicken was cooked through and tender. The rice was fluffy and had absorbed all the liquid, and the top was slightly golden and bubbly. It took hardly 10 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished chicken and rice bake was creamy, savory, and deeply comforting, served hot, straight from the dish, with each person getting a piece of chicken and a generous scoop of the creamy rice underneath that had soaked up all the chicken juices and soup flavors. Some grandmas used cream of celery or cream of chicken soup instead of mushroom for a different flavor profile. Others added a package of dried onion soup mix sprinkled over the top of the chicken before baking for extra seasoning and a salty, savory crust that added texture and depth. A few stirred a cup of frozen peas or mixed vegetables into the rice before adding the chicken, making the dish a complete one-pan meal with vegetables included, so no side dish was needed. The casserole was endlessly adaptable. Whatever canned soup, leftover chicken, or frozen vegetables Grandma had in the pantry could be combined into this dish, and it always came out tender, creamy, and satisfying. It was the ultimate dump and bake recipe that required no browning, no pre-cooking, and almost no cleanup, making it the go-to dinner for busy weeknights when time and energy were both in short supply. It was a hearty soup that stretched 1/2 pound of beef into something thick, filling, and deeply satisfying by adding barley, a grain that swelled up large and chewy and made every spoonful feel substantial. Be almost like eating a stew rather than a thin broth. Grandma cut 1/2 pound of beef chuck or stew meat into very small, bite-sized pieces and seasoned them generously with salt and pepper so the meat would be flavorful throughout. She browned the beef in 2 tablespoons of hot oil in a large, heavy pot over medium-high heat, stirring occasionally until the pieces were golden and crusty on all sides, which took about 7 minutes and created a rich, caramelized flavor base for the soup. The beef was removed and set aside while she added 1 large diced onion, 2 diced carrots, and 2 diced celery stalks to the same pot, cooking them in the remaining beef fat until they were soft and fragrant, which took about 5 minutes and allowed the vegetables to release their natural sweetness. She stirred in 2 minced cloves of garlic and cooked for another minute until the garlic became aromatic and filled the kitchen with a warm, inviting smell. She poured in 6 cups of beef broth or water, added 3/4 of a cup of pearl barley, 1 bay leaf, 1 teaspoon of dried thyme, salt and pepper, then returned the browned beef to the pot and stirred everything together. The soup was brought to a boil. Then the heat was reduced to low, the pot was covered, and the soup was simmered gently for 1 hour, stirring occasionally until the barley was tender and had absorbed much of the liquid, creating a thick, stew-like consistency that clung to the spoon. It took hardly an hour and a half from start to finish. The finished beef and barley soup was thick, hearty, and deeply savory, are served hot in deep bowls with crusty bread or saltine crackers on the side for dipping and soaking up the broth. Some grandmas added diced tomatoes or tomato paste to the soup for extra color and a slight tang that brightened the flavors. Others stirred in a handful of frozen peas or green beans during the last 10 minutes of cooking for extra vegetables and nutrition. A few used leftover roast beef instead of raw stew meat, cutting the cooking time in half since the beef was already tender and just needed to heat through. The barley was the true star of the dish. It absorbed the beef broth, swelled up to nearly triple its size, and created a chewy, satisfying texture that made the soup feel like a complete meal even though it contained very little actual meat. It was a sweet and savory dinner that stretched a package of hot dogs into something hearty and filling by baking them with canned beans, brown sugar, and a tangy mustard glaze that caramelized in the oven and created a sticky, delicious sauce. Grandma opened 2 large cans of pork and beans or baked beans in tomato sauce and poured them into a greased 9 by 13-inch baking dish, spreading them evenly across the bottom so they would bake evenly. She sliced 6 to 8 hot dogs into thick rounds, about half an inch each, and stirred them into the beans so they were evenly distributed throughout the dish, and every serving would get plenty of hot dog slices. She mixed together a 1/4 cup of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of yellow mustard, 1 tablespoon of ketchup, 1 tablespoon of molasses or corn syrup, and a pinch of black pepper in a small bowl, whisking everything together until smooth and well combined, then poured the mixture over the beans and hot dogs, stirring everything together until the sauce was evenly distributed and coating every bean and hot dog slice. Some grandmas added a diced onion or a diced green bell pepper to the beans for extra vegetables, flavor, and texture. Others layered strips of raw bacon over the top of the beans before baking, letting the bacon fat render down into the beans and create a crispy, smoky topping that everyone fought over. The dish was baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the beans were bubbly, the sauce had thickened and caramelized slightly around the edges, and the top was glossy and sticky. It took hardly 10 minutes to assemble before baking. The finished hot dog bean bake was sweet, tangy, savory, and slightly smoky, served hot straight from the dish in deep bowls, with cornbread, biscuits, or buttered white bread on the side for soaking up the sauce. Some grandmas stirred in a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce or a splash of apple cider vinegar to the sauce for extra tang and depth of flavor. Others added a pinch of chili powder or cayenne pepper for a little heat and spice that balanced the sweetness. A few used leftover cooked sausage, diced ham, or even crumbled bacon instead of hot dogs for a different flavor and texture. The dish was endlessly adaptable and incredibly forgiving. Whatever canned beans, hot dogs, or sweeteners Grandma had in the pantry could be combined into this dish, and it always came out sweet, savory, and satisfying. These 45 dinners, from city chicken to hot dog bean bake, stretched every scrap of meat, every can, every grain into meals that filled plates and warmed bellies without emptying wallets. They tasted comforting, looked special, and made every dollar count. Today, they've vanished, replaced by takeout and convenience foods that cost far more. It was a quick dinner that turned leftover chicken and a tube of refrigerated biscuit dough into something fun, filling, and impressive enough for weeknight meals when time was tight and the pantry was nearly bare. Grandma opened 1 tube of refrigerated biscuit dough and separated it into individual biscuits, then rolled each one out on a lightly floured surface until it was about twice its original size, creating thin, round circles of dough that were pliable and easy to work with. She placed a spoonful of diced cooked chicken in the center of each circle, then added a spoonful of cream of chicken soup or white gravy on top of the chicken to keep it moist and add flavor during baking. Some grandmas also added a pinch of shredded cheese, diced celery, or frozen peas to the filling for extra richness, texture, and vegetables that made the roll-ups feel more complete. She folded the dough over the filling, pinching the edges tightly to seal it completely and create a little pocket or half-moon shape, making sure no filling would leak out during baking. Each roll-up was placed seam-side down on a greased baking sheet, spacing them about 2 inches apart so they wouldn't touch during baking and would have room to puff up. The roll-ups were brushed with melted butter and sprinkled lightly with salt, garlic powder, or dried parsley for extra flavor and a golden appetizing finish. They were baked at 375 degrees for 15 to 18 minutes until the biscuit dough was puffed, golden, and cooked through completely. It took hardly 30 minutes from start to finish. The finished chicken biscuit roll-ups were flaky, buttery, and filled with creamy, savory chicken, served hot, straight from the oven with a side of green beans, a simple salad, or a bowl of soup to round out the meal. Some grandmas served the roll-ups with extra gravy or cream of chicken soup on the side for dipping, which children especially loved. Others used leftover turkey instead of chicken, especially after Thanksgiving when there was plenty to use up and no one wanted to eat the same meal 2 days in a row. A few added diced ham or cooked sausage to the filling for a heartier, meatier version that felt more substantial. The beauty of the roll-ups was that they looked impressive and tasted homemade, but they came together so quickly and easily using store-bought biscuit dough that even the busiest, most exhausted grandma could have dinner on the table in under half an hour without breaking a sweat or spending much money. It was a simple dinner that turned a small amount of leftover ham into something rich and satisfying by serving it in a thick, creamy white sauce ladled generously over warm, crumbly cornbread that soaked up every drop of the savory gravy. Grandma melted 4 tablespoons of butter in a medium saucepan over medium heat, then whisked in 4 tablespoons of flour to make a thick roux, cooking it for about 1 minute until it smelled slightly nutty but hadn't browned or burned. She slowly poured in 2 cups of milk while whisking constantly to prevent lumps from forming, then stirred the sauce over medium heat until it thickened and became smooth, creamy, and coated the back of a spoon perfectly. She added 1½ cups of diced cooked ham, 1 small diced onion that had been sautéed until soft and translucent, salt, pepper, and a pinch of black pepper for extra warmth and a subtle, spicy kick. Then simmered the mixture gently for 5 more minutes until the ham was heated through and the flavors had melded together beautifully. It took hardly 20 minutes from start to finish. Meanwhile, she baked a pan of cornbread from scratch or from a boxed mix, slicing it into large squares while it was still warm and placing 1 or 2 squares on each plate so they would absorb the creamed ham sauce. The creamed ham was ladled generously over the top of the cornbread, soaking into the crumbly, buttery bread and creating a comforting, satisfying combination of textures and flavors that everyone loved. Some grandmas added frozen peas or diced carrots to the creamed ham for extra vegetables, color, and nutrition. Others stirred in a tablespoon of Dijon mustard or a splash of Worcestershire sauce for extra tang and depth of flavor that balanced the richness of the cream sauce. It was an elegant dinner that stretched a small amount of chicken into something creamy, cheesy, and impressive enough for Sunday suppers or when company came over unexpectedly and Grandma needed to make a good impression without spending much money. Grandma steamed or boiled 2 large bunches of fresh broccoli or 2 packages of frozen broccoli florets until they were just tender but still bright green and not mushy, then drained them very well and arranged them in a single layer across the bottom of a greased 9 by 13-inch baking dish. She placed 2 cups of diced cooked chicken or sliced chicken breasts on top of the broccoli, spreading it evenly so every portion would get some meat and no one would feel short-changed. Meanwhile, she made a rich cream sauce by melting 4 tablespoons of butter in a saucepan, whisking in 4 tablespoons of flour to make a thick roux, then slowly adding 2 cups of chicken broth and 1 cup of heavy cream while whisking constantly until the sauce thickened and became smooth, velvety, and coated the back of a spoon perfectly. She stirred in half a cup of grated Parmesan cheese, 2 tablespoons of sherry or lemon juice for brightness, and a hint of acidity, salt, pepper, and a pinch of nutmeg for warmth and depth, then poured the sauce evenly over the chicken and broccoli, making sure everything was well coated and nothing was dry. The dish was topped with another half-cup of grated Parmesan cheese mixed with half a cup of breadcrumbs for a crunchy, golden topping that added texture and visual appeal, then baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the sauce was bubbly and the top was golden brown and crispy. It took hardly 50 minutes from start to finish. The finished chicken divan was rich, creamy, and indulgent, with the broccoli adding bulk and nutrition, while the chicken provided just enough protein to make it feel like a proper main course. It was served hot, straight from the dish, with a side of rice, noodles, or crusty bread to soak up the extra sauce and make the meal even more filling. Some grandmas used cream of chicken soup instead of making the sauce from scratch, which saved time and effort but still tasted delicious. Others added sliced mushrooms or diced pimentos to the dish for extra vegetables, color, and flavor. A few used leftover turkey instead of chicken, especially after Thanksgiving or Christmas when there was plenty to use up and everyone was tired of eating the same thing day after day. It was a stretching dinner that turned a package of bologna and a head of cabbage into something savory, filling, and surprisingly satisfying for weeknight meals when the budget was especially tight and the pantry was nearly bare. Grandma cut 1 pound of bologna into thick slices, about half an inch each, and scored the edges with a sharp knife in 4 places to prevent them from curling up during frying and to help them cook evenly. She heated 2 tablespoons of oil or bacon fat in a large cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat, then fried the bologna slices for about 2 minutes on each side until they were browned, crispy on the edges, and slightly caramelized, releasing a smoky, savory aroma that filled the kitchen. The bologna was removed and set aside, while she added 1 large diced onion to the same skillet, cooking it in the remaining fat until soft and golden, which took about 5 minutes and added a sweet, savory depth to the dish. She added half a head of cabbage, shredded or thinly sliced, to the skillet along with salt, pepper, and a pinch of caraway seeds for extra flavor and a hint of earthiness, then stirred everything together and cooked for another 10 minutes, stirring occasionally until the cabbage wilted, softened, and began to caramelize slightly around the edges, creating little bits of crispy, sweet, golden cabbage throughout. The fried bologna slices were returned to the skillet, nestled into the cabbage and onions, and everything was heated through for another 3 minutes until warmed and well combined, with the flavors melding together beautifully. It took hardly 30 minutes from start to finish. The finished bologna and cabbage skillet was savory, slightly sweet from the caramelized onions, and surprisingly filling, served hot in shallow bowls with boiled potatoes, rye bread, or buttered noodles on the side to round out the meal. Some grandmas added a splash of apple cider vinegar or a tablespoon of mustard to the cabbage for extra tang and brightness that cut through the richness of the fried bologna. Others stirred in diced apples or raisins for a sweet and savory combination that balanced the saltiness of the bologna and added unexpected pops of sweetness. A few used thick-cut ham or summer sausage instead of bologna for a slightly fancier, smokier version that felt more special. The dish was humble, inexpensive, and deeply rooted in Depression-era cooking, but it was also comforting, satisfying, and surprisingly delicious, proving that simple ingredients could create something truly special when combined with care and attention. It was a clever dinner that turned a bag of potato chips into both a crispy coating and a stretching ingredient for chicken, making a small amount of meat go further while adding crunch, flavor, and a fun twist that children especially loved. Grandma crushed about 2 cups of plain potato chips in a sealed plastic bag using a rolling pin until they were finely ground into crumbs, then poured them into a shallow dish and set them aside. She cut 1 pound of boneless, skinless chicken breasts into thin cutlets or strips, pounding them slightly with a meat mallet to make them thinner, more tender, and more likely to cook evenly. Each piece of chicken was seasoned with salt and pepper, dipped in beaten egg mixed with a tablespoon of milk to help the coating stick, then pressed firmly into the crushed potato chips, coating both sides completely with a thick, even layer of crumbs that would crisp up beautifully in the oven. The coated chicken pieces were placed on a greased baking sheet, spaced about 2 inches apart so they would crisp up evenly and not steam each other, then drizzled lightly with melted butter for extra richness, golden color, and to help the chips brown and crisp up even more. They were baked at 375 degrees for 25 minutes, flipping once halfway through until the chicken was cooked through completely and the potato chip coating was golden, crispy, and crunchy all over. It took hardly 40 minutes from start to finish. The finished potato chip chicken was crispy, salty, and surprisingly flavorful, with the chips adding both crunch and a savory, slightly buttery taste that didn't need any additional seasoning or sauces. It was served hot with a side of mashed potatoes, green beans, or a simple salad, and many children loved it because it tasted like a fun, crunchy snack turned into dinner and didn't taste like health food or boring boiled chicken. Some grandmas used flavored potato chips, barbecue, sour cream and onion, or salt and vinegar for extra flavor and variety that made the dish feel even more exciting. Others mixed the crushed chips with breadcrumbs or cornflake crumbs to stretch them even further and make the coating go twice as far. A few pan-fried the chicken in a skillet instead of baking it for an even crispier, more golden coating, though that required more oil and attention and wasn't quite as hands-off as the baked version. These 50 dinners, from city chicken to potato chip chicken, stretched every scrap of meat, every pantry staple, every leftover into meals that filled plates, warmed bellies, and cost almost nothing. They looked special, tasted comforting, and made every dollar count. Today they've vanished, replaced by takeout and convenience foods that cost more. It was a filling dinner that stretched a small amount of chicken into something hearty and satisfying by combining it with cornmeal mush, a thick, porridge-like side dish that swelled up large and filled everyone's belly without costing much at all. Grandma boiled 1 small chicken or 2 pounds of chicken pieces in a large pot of water with 1 diced onion, 2 diced carrots, 2 diced celery stalks, salt and pepper until the meat was tender and falling off the bones, which took about 90 minutes of gentle simmering. She removed the chicken, picked the meat clean, discarding the skin and bones, and returned the shredded meat to the pot along with the strained broth. keeping it warm on the back of the stove. Meanwhile, she made the cornmeal mush by bringing 4 cups of water or chicken broth to a boil in a separate large pot, then slowly whisking in 1½ cups of yellow cornmeal in a thin, steady stream while stirring constantly to prevent lumps from forming. The cornmeal was cooked over low heat, stirring frequently, for about 20 minutes until it thickened into a smooth, creamy, spoonable consistency that was thick enough to hold its shape on a plate but still soft and comforting. She stirred in 2 tablespoons of butter, salt, and pepper to taste, then poured the hot cornmeal mush onto serving plates or into shallow bowls, creating a thick golden bed. The shredded chicken and broth were ladled generously over the top of the cornmeal mush, soaking into it and creating a rich, savory combination of textures and flavors that everyone loved. It took hardly 2 hours total, with most of that time being passive simmering. Some grandmas added a splash of cream or milk to the cornmeal mush for extra richness and a smoother texture. Others stirred in a handful of shredded cheese at the end for a cheesier and more indulgent version that children especially loved. A few used leftover turkey instead of chicken, especially after the holidays when there was plenty to use up, and no one wanted to see another whole bird. The cornmeal mush was inexpensive, filling, and incredibly comforting, making it the perfect stretching ingredient that allowed Grandma to make a little bit of chicken feed an entire table without anyone feeling like they didn't get enough to eat, or that dinner was lacking in substance or satisfaction. It was a stretching dinner that turned 1/2 pound of beef into something colorful, nutritious, and filling by adding a huge amount of fresh or frozen vegetables that made the dish look abundant and impressive, even though the actual meat content was quite small. Grandma cut 1/2 pound of beef chuck or round steak into very small, thin strips and seasoned them generously with salt, pepper, and a pinch of garlic powder for extra flavor. She browned the beef strips quickly in 2 tablespoons of hot oil in a large, deep skillet over high heat, stirring constantly for about 3 minutes until they were seared on all sides but still slightly pink inside, then removed them and set them aside. In the same skillet, she added 1 large diced onion, 2 diced carrots, 2 diced celery stalks, 1 diced green bell pepper, and 1 cup of sliced mushrooms, cooking them in the remaining beef fat until they were soft, fragrant, and beginning to caramelize slightly around the edges, which took about 7 minutes. She added 2 cups of diced fresh tomatoes or 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1 cup of frozen peas or green beans, 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, 1 teaspoon of dried thyme, salt, and pepper, stirring everything together and bringing it to a gentle simmer. The browned beef strips were returned to the skillet, nestled into the vegetable mixture, and everything was simmered together for another 10 minutes until the vegetables were tender. The flavors had melded together, and the sauce had thickened slightly. It took hardly 35 minutes from start to finish. The finished beef and vegetable medley was colorful, savory, and surprisingly filling, with the vegetables taking center stage and the beef acting more as a flavoring agent than the main protein. It was served hot over steamed white rice, mashed potatoes, or buttered noodles to soak up the rich, flavorful sauce. Some grandmas added a splash of soy sauce or a tablespoon of brown sugar to the sauce for a sweet and savory Asian-inspired twist. Others stirred in a handful of fresh spinach or shredded cabbage during the last few minutes of cooking for extra greens and nutrition. A few thickened the sauce with a cornstarch slurry at the end to make it glossy and clingy, coating every vegetable and beef strip perfectly. The dish was incredibly adaptable. Whatever vegetables Grandma had in the garden or the freezer could be added to the skillet, and it always came out colorful, nutritious, and satisfying. It was a sweet and savory dinner that stretched a small amount of chicken into something tropical, colorful, and impressive enough for Sunday suppers or when company came over unexpectedly and Grandma needed to make a good impression. Grandma cut 1 pound of boneless, skinless chicken breasts or thighs into bite-sized cubes and seasoned them with salt, pepper, and a pinch of ginger for warmth and a hint of spice. She browned the chicken pieces in 2 tablespoons of hot oil in a large, deep skillet over medium-high heat, stirring occasionally until they were golden on all sides, which took about 5 minutes. The chicken was removed and set aside, while she added 1 large diced onion and 1 diced green bell pepper to the same skillet, cooking them in the remaining chicken fat until they were soft and fragrant, which took about 5 minutes. She stirred in 1 can of pineapple chunks with the juice, a 1/4 cup of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of soy sauce, 2 tablespoons of vinegar or lemon juice, 1 tablespoon of ketchup, and a pinch of red pepper flakes for a hint of heat, mixing everything together and bringing it to a simmer. The sauce was allowed to cook for about 3 minutes until it thickened slightly and became glossy and clingy. The browned chicken was returned to the skillet, tossed to coat it in the sweet, tangy sauce, and simmered for another 5 minutes until the chicken was cooked through and the flavors had melded together beautifully. It took hardly 30 minutes from start to finish. The finished pineapple chicken was sweet, tangy, savory, and slightly spicy, with the pineapple adding bursts of tropical sweetness and the sauce creating a glossy, appetizing glaze. It was served hot over a huge mound of steamed white rice that soaked up the sauce and made the meal feel abundant and filling, even though the actual amount of chicken was quite small. Some grandmas added diced carrots, snap peas, or water chestnuts to the skillet for extra vegetables, crunch, and nutrition. Others thickened the sauce with a cornstarch slurry at the end to make it even glossier and more restaurant style. A few used leftover pork or even shrimp instead of chicken for variety and a different flavor profile. The dish felt exotic and special, like something from a Chinese restaurant, but it came together quickly and easily using pantry staples and whatever protein Grandma had on hand. It was a stretching dinner that turned leftover chicken and a little bit of pastry dough into something portable, impressive, and filling enough for weeknight meals or even packed lunches the next day. Grandma mixed 2 cups of finely diced cooked chicken with 1 cup of mashed potatoes or cooked rice, 1 small diced onion, 2 tablespoons of chopped fresh parsley, a 1/4 cup of chicken gravy or cream of chicken soup, salt, pepper, and a pinch of thyme in a large bowl until everything was well combined and held together like a thick, moldable paste. She rolled out a batch of pie dough or biscuit dough on a floured surface until it was about 1/8 of an inch thick, then cut it into 6 large circles using a bowl or a large round cutter. She placed a generous spoonful of the chicken filling in the center of each circle, then folded the dough over the filling to create a half-moon shape, pressing the edges firmly with a fork to seal them completely and create a decorative crimped edge. Each turnover was placed on a greased baking sheet spaced about 2 inches apart, then brushed with beaten egg or melted butter for a golden, shiny finish. They were baked at 375 degrees for 25 to 30 minutes until the pastry was golden, flaky, and cooked through completely. It took hardly 50 minutes from start to finish. The finished chicken turnovers were flaky, buttery, and filled with creamy, savory chicken, served hot or warm with a side of gravy, cranberry sauce, or a simple green salad. Some grandmas added diced carrots, celery, or frozen peas to the filling for extra vegetables and color. Others used leftover turkey instead of chicken, especially after Thanksgiving when there was plenty to use up. A few fried the turnovers in hot oil instead of baking them for a crispier, more golden crust, though that required more oil and attention. The turnovers were perfect for using up leftovers, stretching a little bit of meat into something filling, and creating a portable meal that could be eaten with your hands, making them popular with children and adults alike. They could be made ahead, frozen, and reheated later, making them the ultimate make-ahead meal that saved time and money. It was a sweet and savory dinner that stretched a small number of pork chops into something filling and impressive by serving them with a generous amount of cooked apples that made the plate look abundant and satisfying. Grandma seasoned 4 to 6 thin-cut pork chops with salt, pepper, and a pinch of cinnamon for warmth and a hint of sweetness. She browned the pork chops in 2 tablespoons of hot oil or butter in a large cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat for about 3 minutes on each side until they were golden and crispy on the outside but still juicy inside. The chops were removed and set aside while she added 2 large apples, peeled, cored, and sliced into thick wedges, to the same skillet, cooking them in the remaining pork fat until they began to soften and caramelize slightly, which took about 5 minutes. She sprinkled 2 tablespoons of brown sugar over the apples, added a pinch of cinnamon and a splash of apple cider or water, then stirred everything together and simmered for another 3 minutes until the apples were tender and the sauce had thickened into a sweet, glossy glaze. The browned pork chops were returned to the skillet, nestled into the apples, and everything was heated through for another 3 minutes until the chops were cooked through and the flavors had melded together beautifully. It took hardly 25 minutes from start to finish. The finished pork chops with apples were sweet, savory, and deeply comforting, with the apples adding bulk, sweetness, and a beautiful presentation that made the meal feel special, even though it was quite simple and inexpensive. It was served hot with mashed potatoes, buttered noodles, or a side of green beans to round out the meal. Some grandmas added a splash of maple syrup or honey to the apples for extra sweetness and richness. Others stirred in a handful of raisins or dried cranberries for extra fruit and a chewy texture. A few used pears instead of apples for a slightly more delicate, elegant flavor that felt more sophisticated. The dish was perfect for fall and winter when apples were plentiful and inexpensive, and it proved that simple ingredients could create something truly special when combined with care and attention. These 55 dinners, from city chicken to pork chops with apples, stretched every cut of meat, every leftover, every fruit and vegetable into meals that filled plates, warmed bellies, and cost almost nothing. They looked special, tasted comforting, and made every dollar count. Today, they've vanished, replaced by convenience foods and takeout. It was a filling dinner that turned the most affordable and often overlooked protein into something tender, flavorful, and surprisingly popular with children who grew up eating it regularly. Grandma sliced 1 pound of beef liver into thin strips, about a 1/4 inch thick, and soaked them in a bowl of milk for 30 minutes to remove any bitterness and make the liver milder and more palatable. She drained the liver, patted it dry with paper towels, then seasoned it generously with salt and pepper and dredged it lightly in flour, shaking off the excess so it would brown evenly. She heated 2 tablespoons of bacon fat or butter in a large cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat, then browned the liver strips quickly for about 2 minutes on each side until they were golden and slightly crispy on the outside, but still pink and tender inside. The liver was removed and set aside, while she added 2 large sliced onions to the same skillet, cooking them in the remaining fat until they were soft, golden, and caramelized, which took about 10 minutes and filled the kitchen with a sweet, savory aroma. Some grandmas added a splash of Worcestershire sauce or a tablespoon of vinegar to the gravy for extra tang and depth. Others stirred in a handful of sliced mushrooms or crispy bacon pieces for extra texture and flavor. A few used chicken livers instead of beef liver for a milder, more delicate flavor that was easier for children to accept. The liver was incredibly affordable, packed with nutrients, and filled everyone up without costing much, making it a staple on many 1950s tables, even though it has largely disappeared from modern menus due to changing tastes and the perception that liver is old-fashioned or unappetizing. It was a stretching dinner that turned half a pound of beef into something that looked and tasted abundant by combining it with a huge amount of caramelized onions that filled the skillet and made every serving feel generous and satisfying. Grandma cut half a pound of beef round or sirloin into very thin strips, about a quarter-inch thick, and seasoned them generously with salt, pepper, and a pinch of paprika for color and a subtle smoky flavor. She heated 2 tablespoons of oil in a large cast-iron skillet over high heat, then quickly seared the beef strips for about 2 minutes on each side until they were browned and slightly crispy on the outside, but still juicy and pink inside. The beef was removed and set aside while she added 3 large sliced onions to the same skillet, cooking them in the remaining beef fat over medium heat, stirring occasionally until they were soft, golden, and deeply caramelized, which took about 20 minutes and required patience, but created an incredibly sweet, rich flavor. The browned beef strips were returned to the skillet, untossed to coat them in the oniony sauce, and simmered for another 3 minutes until the beef was heated through and the flavors had melded together beautifully. It took hardly 35 minutes from start to finish. The finished beef and onion skillet was rich, savory, and deeply satisfying, with the caramelized onions making the dish look and taste like there was far more beef than there actually was. It was served hot over steamed white rice, mashed potatoes, or buttered noodles to soak up the rich oniony gravy and make the meal even more filling. Some grandmas added sliced mushrooms to the onions for extra vegetables and an earthy, meaty flavor. Others stirred in a splash of red wine or a tablespoon of soy sauce for extra depth and complexity. A few thickened the sauce with a cornstarch slurry at the end to make it glossy and clingy, coating every beef strip and onion perfectly. The dish proved that with the right technique and patience, a little bit of beef could go a long way. It was an impressive dinner that made inexpensive chicken pieces look and taste like something from a fancy restaurant by breading them heavily and frying them until golden and crispy all over. Grandma cut 1 whole chicken into pieces, drumsticks, thighs, wings, and breasts, then seasoned them generously with salt, pepper, and a pinch of paprika for color and flavor. She set up a breading station with 3 shallow dishes, one with flour, one with beaten eggs mixed with a tablespoon of milk, and one with fine breadcrumbs or crushed crackers. Each chicken piece was dredged in flour, shaking off the excess, then dipped in the egg mixture, and finally pressed firmly into the breadcrumbs, coating it completely and evenly on all sides to create a thick, crunchy crust. The breaded chicken pieces were placed on a baking sheet and chilled in the refrigerator for 15 minutes to help the coating stick and prevent it from falling off during frying. She heated about 1 inch of oil in a large cast-iron skillet over medium heat until it was shimmering and hot, then carefully added the chicken pieces in batches, frying them for about 5 minutes on each side until the coating was deep golden brown and crispy. The fried chicken was transferred to a wire rack set over a baking sheet and finished in a 350-degree oven for 20 minutes until the chicken was cooked through completely and the juices ran clear. It took hardly an hour from start to finish. The finished chicken Maryland was golden, crispy, and incredibly flavorful, with a thick, crunchy coating that stayed on the chicken perfectly and didn't get soggy or fall off. It was served hot with cream gravy, mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, and biscuits, creating a complete Southern-style feast that looked and tasted like something from a restaurant. Some grandmas added a pinch of cayenne pepper or hot sauce to the breadcrumbs for a spicy kick. Others used cornmeal instead of breadcrumbs for a crunchier, more textured coating. The dish was labor-intensive but incredibly rewarding, turning inexpensive chicken pieces into something that felt special and celebratory. It was a quick dinner that turned a can of corned beef and a few potatoes into something crispy, savory, and filling enough for weeknight meals when time and money were both in short supply. Grandma opened one can of corned beef, drained it well, then broke it up into small chunks with a fork in a large bowl. She added 3 large boiled potatoes, peeled and diced into small cubes, 1 small diced onion, salt, pepper, and a pinch of paprika, then mixed everything together gently so the potatoes wouldn't turn into mush. She heated 2 tablespoons of oil or bacon fat in a large cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat, then pressed the hash mixture firmly into the skillet, spreading it evenly and pressing it down with a spatula to create a flat, even layer that would crisp up beautifully. The hash was cooked undisturbed for about 7 minutes until the bottom was deeply golden, crispy, and had formed a thick crust that held together when flipped. She carefully flipped the entire hash in one piece, like a giant pancake, then cooked the other side for another 7 minutes until it was golden and crispy all over. It took hardly 25 minutes from start to finish. The finished corned beef hash was crispy on the outside, soft and savory on the inside, served hot in wedges with a fried egg on top, and a side of buttered toast for a complete, satisfying meal. Some grandmas added diced green peppers or celery to the hash for extra vegetables and crunch. Others stirred in a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce or hot sauce for extra flavor and tang. It proved that simple ingredients could create something crispy, satisfying, and deeply comforting when cooked with care and attention. It was a simple dinner that combined 2 of the cheapest, most kid-friendly ingredients into something quick, filling, and surprisingly delicious the children actually asked for by name. Grandma brought a large pot of salted water to a boil, added 2 cups of elbow macaroni, and cooked it according to the package directions until just tender, then drained it and set it aside. Meanwhile, she sliced 6 to 8 hot dogs into thick rounds, about half an inch each, and browned them in 2 tablespoons of butter in a large, deep skillet over medium heat, stirring occasionally until they were golden and slightly crispy on the edges, which took about 5 minutes. She added 1 small diced onion to the skillet and cooked it until soft and translucent, which took another 5 minutes, then stirred in 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice, 1 tablespoon of ketchup, 1 teaspoon of yellow mustard, a pinch of sugar to balance the acidity, salt and pepper, mixing everything together and bringing it to a gentle simmer. The cooked macaroni was added to the skillet and tossed with the hot dog mixture until every piece of pasta was coated in the tangy, savory sauce. The skillet was simmered for another 5 minutes, stirring occasionally until the flavors had melded together and the sauce had thickened slightly and clung to the macaroni. It took hardly 25 minutes from start to finish. The finished hot dog and macaroni skillet was tangy, savory, and slightly sweet, with the hot dogs adding a meaty, smoky flavor and the macaroni making the meal filling and satisfying. It was served hot in deep bowls, often with a sprinkle of grated cheddar cheese on top and a side of buttered white bread or saltine crackers. Some grandmas added a diced green bell pepper or a handful of frozen peas to the skillet for extra vegetables and color. Others stirred in a spoonful of sour cream or a pat of butter at the end for a creamier, richer finish. A few used leftover cooked sausage or even canned Vienna sausages instead of hot dogs for variety. The dish was incredibly economical, came together in under half an hour, and was beloved by children who saw it as a treat rather than a budget meal, proving that sometimes the simplest, cheapest dinners were the ones that created the happiest memories. These 60 forgotten dinners fed America through the tightest budgets and the hardest years. Grandma didn't need expensive cuts, fancy ingredients, or complicated techniques. She had ground beef, canned tuna, a few hot dogs, and the stubborn belief that her table would be full no matter what the bank account said. She stretched every pound of meat, every leftover scrap, every pantry staple into meals that looked special, tasted comforting, and made everyone feel cared for. These recipes weren't just food, they were survival, dignity, and love, measured in skillets and casserole dishes. By the 1980s, we forgot. Microwave dinners replaced cast-iron skillets. Drive-thrus replaced homemade casseroles. Jarred sauces replaced simmering pots. We traded Grandma's recipes for convenience, and we lost something irreplaceable in the process. We lost the knowledge that a can of tuna and a cup of rice could become dinner, that a package of hot dogs and a head of cabbage could feed a table, that creativity and care mattered more than money. But these recipes still exist. They're written in faded handwriting on index cards tucked in drawers, whispered in the memories of those who watched her cook, preserved in church cookbooks, gathering dust on shelves. They're waiting for us to remember. They're waiting for us to slow down, to open a can, to boil a pot of noodles, to stir flour into drippings and make gravy the way she did. They're waiting for us to teach the next generation that food doesn't have to be expensive to be good, that a casserole baked with care tastes better than any takeout, that sitting around a table sharing a simple meal is more valuable than anything money can buy. Which of these did your mother make for you as a special treat?